Hi there, everybody. So this is our last week of content before we head into finals. And we're covering chapter 12 this week, which is social psychology, which is actually my area of specialty. I am a social psychologist. So we're going to be going through my particular topic this week, and I'm so excited about it. So social psychology is unique in the field of psychology because it studies how a person, their behavior, thoughts, and feelings, can be influenced by social groups and can in turn influence others. So it's about how our behavior, our thoughts, and our feelings occur within a social context and how other people can influence how we feel and how we in turn can influence others. So it takes all those things and puts it within a greater context once again. Another interesting thing to consider is when I talk about how we can be influenced by others, those others can be actual, imagined, or implied. So when I talk about actual others influencing us, that's fairly easy for us to imagine. The whole notion of there being another person in the room, which might change how we might behave than we would if we were by ourselves, that makes sense. Imagined and implied is a little harder to imagine. But if you think about, for example, a sign on the highway that says your speed is being monitored by speed checking devices, or when you go into a changing room at a store, it says smile, you're on camera. That would be an implied presence of others, where we might behave in a slightly different way than if those signs weren't around. And of course, we imagine people all the time. We come up with imaginary points of comparison. How are we doing in comparison to the average college student? We come up all the time with imagining what our parents would think of our behavior, or what our future self might think about us right now, or where we want to be in the future. So we use our imagination all the time, and that can have an impact on our behavior. In addition, sometimes, once again, we can be influenced by imaginary fictional characters in a novel or in a film that really impact us deeply. So all of those things recognize the reality of our social context, that our social context can be full of actual influence of others as well as imagined others and implied others. So Kurt Lewin was the father of modern social psychology. He's a really interesting guy. He came over to the United States as a German Jewish man fleeing Hitler during World War II. Many scientists came over from Europe during World War II, and he established a school of social psychology in the United States. That means a few things. It means that social psychology was really established in the United States, and the majority of social psychologists are United States based, for one thing. And it also means, once again, that social psychology was profoundly influenced by the actions of the day, and it still is to this day. So the sorts of topics that social psychologists study tend to be very rooted in our historical moment. Right now, social psychologists are studying pandemic behavior. So social psychology tends to be very much based in its historical context. Another fun fact is that I can actually trace my academic lineage directly to Kurt Lewin. So for example, I was taught by Richard Smith at University of Kentucky. He was taught by John Tybo at Boston, and John Tybo was taught by Kurt Lewin. So I can trace directly to the father of modern social psychology. This is one of his famous quotes: "No research without action, no action without research." And one of the things that this means is that it's very important to study social problems and to use research in order to improve those social problems. So this implies that social psychology has an applied component to it, where it's important to study the social problems, but to not just study them, but to develop applied solutions. So for example, in my social psychology class this semester, students can do one of two different final projects. One of those projects is to develop a follow-up study to research that they've already read during the semester, and the other option is to develop a community intervention of some kind that is based in research. So this is one of the basic things about social psychology. Social psychology is very much an applied field where we study social problems and develop applied solutions as a part of it. It's more applied than some of the other areas of psychology. So one of the first social psychology studies ever run was by Norman Triplett in 1895. Now this is of course before social psychology was established as a field, but it still is the first study that systematically explored the effect that other people can have on our thoughts, feelings, and behavior. Now Norman was an enormous fan of bicycle races. He was a sports nut and he followed bicycle racers very closely in terms of their performance and tracked the star bicycle racers of his time. And one of the things that Norman noticed was he noticed that whenever bicycle racers were doing time trials solo, that they were about 20% slower and they were 20% faster when they were racing with other people. And this was interesting because it was a substantial increase in speed from the solo time trials to bicycle races with other people in the race. And so Norman specifically wanted to explore in a systematic way how our task performance can be influenced by the presence or absence of other people. So he got a bunch of kids together and timed them in terms of how fast they were reeling in a fishing line. And he either had them by themselves or with other kids in the room to see which group was faster. So he was able to explore this in a systematic way with random assignment and have it under controlled circumstances so we could actually see if this phenomenon would replicate in a laboratory setting. And he was able to replicate that particular phenomenon. So what Triplett discovered is what any athlete will tell you, that when you're in a race or competing against other people, that you expend more effort. So this is a process known as social facilitation, that when we're in competition with other people, we expend more effort than when we're just doing something by ourselves. The presence of others is physiologically arousing, and so it's easier for us to expend more effort. Here's a fun thing about this particular phenomenon. If it's an easy task, that arousal results in better performance. So if we've practiced it a lot and we can depend on our muscle memory and it's something that we find easy, then that arousal works in our favor. But if it's a complex task, that arousal can actually work against us and we can make more mistakes. So for example, when I was in high school, I studied violin. And whenever I was in competition, I would always get really worked up and I would make so many more mistakes in competition. One of the reasons why was because I didn't practice enough, so I couldn't depend on my muscle memory. It was a complex task and it was one that I found difficult. And as a result, that competition made me choke instead of improving my performance. So it's interesting to think about how that arousal can sometimes work against us in cases of a complex or difficult task. Another interesting variety that we've explored since Triplett is how cooperation can change the game. Anyone who's ever done group work will be familiar with this concept of social loafing, where when you're cooperating with others in a group, you expend less effort than when you're working by yourself. So people can kind of coast a little bit when they're working in a group setting and expend less effort. We've actually explored this scientifically with people yelling as loudly as they can or pulling on a rope with as much effort as they can in terms of pounds per inch. And we've measured how people actually have fewer decibels of volume when they're yelling as a part of a group as opposed to when they're yelling as loud as they can by themselves. That we coast a little bit when we're surrounded by other people who are cooperating with us. So a very broad area of social psychology research is that of social influence. So we're going to talk a lot about social influence and more specifically conformity research for this next part of our video today. And social influence is how the real or implied presence of others can influence behavior. Conformity is a result of social influence. So conformity is when you change your behavior to match that of other people. I have a really good example of conformity in one of the videos that I've posted in the supplemental materials. That's a candid camera prank show where a bunch of people change direction in an elevator based on social influence cues. So we can think of them changing direction in the elevator, that decision that they make, as being one of conformity. Now there's two different motivations behind conformity. So we're going to study two different forms of social influence. The first is informational social influence. So informational social influence is when you're uncertain of the correct answer and you wish to be correct. So you look to others in the group to inform you about whether you're right. So once again, the key here is uncertainty. When you're not sure of the right answer, you look to the others around you, and then when they give you the answer, you believe them. This typically works with something that's a little bit more ambiguous. So I like to think of informational social influence wouldn't be working if you were asked a very simple math problem that you knew the answer to. If you were asked, what's 2 + 2? You wouldn't look to your neighbor for the answer. If you were asked a more ambiguous question, for example, how many jelly beans are in this jar, or what's the answer to this more complex math problem, you might lean a little bit more heavily on your neighbors and look to them more for the answer. So uncertainty is key with informational social influence. We also trust a group of people around us more if they're more knowledgeable. We see informational social influence at work all the time with game shows where you can call a more knowledgeable friend or poll the audience for the answer in a game show quiz. And usually when people do that, they'll trust whatever the person that they called or polled says in terms of what the right answer is because they don't know it themselves. You can think of informational social influence as being at work with that last person in the candid camera video that you can watch, who's a very young person who looks a little uncomfortable and as if they don't know how to behave in an elevator. That might be one of the factors that's at work a little bit more with him than with the other people in the elevator because he really doesn't seem to be very certain about how to behave. And once again, the key here is that you don't know what the right answer is and you believe what the group tells you. Normative social influence is a slightly different sort of motivation. Here, the goal isn't to be correct, rather it's to fit in. And sometimes this particular goal can cut directly against the goal to be correct. So in this particular case, people feel pressure to change their outward behavior regardless of what they might think or feel on the inside. So for example, you might laugh at an offensive joke that you don't think is funny to fit in. The classic version of this is the Asch perception experiment. I've provided a clip for you to take a look at that follows the Asch perception experiment, but it's a fairly simple sort of premise. Basically, what Solomon Asch did was he got together participants and he put them in a room, one at a time, with 6 other people around a table. And those 6 other people were trained to provide certain answers to a very simple question. So Asch would show the line on the left, and then he'd show the card on the right, and he'd say, which one is closest to this line? Now, this is a very simple task, and most people, when looking at this, 100% of the time, would say it's line number 2. In fact, participants, when they were by themselves, never got the wrong answer. And what he did then is he trained the 6 people in the room who were Confederates, who were plants, to give the wrong answer after a few sessions and see how many participants would change their answer from one they knew to be right to one that was wrong, but that the other group members said. So you can imagine going through this activity and showing this card, and all of a sudden everyone around you says, oh, the closest one is number 1. It's number 1. I think it's number 1 too. Oh, I also think it's number 1. Yep, it's number 1. Number 1, and then it's your turn. What do you say? Do you say 1 or do you say 2, the actual correct answer? And what Asch found was that about 60% of the time, participants change their answer to the wrong one, and that most people change their answer at least once in the face of all this social influence to an answer, once again, that they knew to be incorrect. The key here is that certainty was not at work. People were very sure what the right answer was, so when they were changing their answer, they weren't changing their answer to be correct, they were changing their answer to fit in. Sometimes what we can experience when we undergo normative social influence is something known as cognitive dissonance. So cognitive dissonance is when our outward actions or behavior doesn't fit our internal thoughts and feelings. So for example, when we laugh at a joke that we find offensive or change our answer to a line that clearly is a wrong answer just because other people also said so, even though we know it's not right, that can create a sense of discomfort or distress known as cognitive dissonance. It's interesting to note that we have a choice. When we're in an uncomfortable state, we often try to reduce it. And one of the ways that we can reduce it is by changing our behavior. Another way we can reduce it is by changing our attitude, or we can create a new attitude. And what research actually shows is that it's a great deal easier for us to change our attitude about something than it is for us to change our behavior. So when encountered with cognitive dissonance, people end up changing their mind a little bit more than they do changing their behavior. So for example, they might say, well, maybe I wasn't seeing things properly, or maybe there were rules I wasn't aware of, rather than changing their behavior to the uncomfortable choice of going against the group. This is a classic example of cognitive dissonance at work in a study that was done by Festinger and Carlsmith. So basically, Festinger and Carlsmith set up a task where they had people turn a knob a quarter turn, and they had a whole wall of these knobs, and they'd move through and turn each knob a quarter turn, and when they got to the bottom, they'd go back up to the top again and move each one a quarter turn, and they do that for an hour. It was intended to be incredibly, stupidly boring. This was done in the 1970s, and they either paid people $1 or they paid them $20. In the 1970s, $20 was a fair bit, right? It could get you a really nice dinner. So what they did then is they asked people in both of those groups to convince the next participant coming down and to do the task that the task was interesting and fun. And then they asked the participant who'd just done this, who just talked to the other participant and convinced them that it was fun, they asked them to rate how enjoyable they actually found the task. And what they found is that the $1 group had a more positive attitude toward the task in reality. They said, well, maybe it was actually kind of fun. And what we saw going on there is a classic example of attitude change in the face of cognitive dissonance. That people who were just paid $1 went to themselves, why did I just spend an entire hour doing this ridiculously boring task and then tell someone that it was fun? It must be because it was actually kind of enjoyable, because I certainly didn't get paid enough to justify doing that. Whereas people who got paid $20 went, why did I do this for an hour and then tell someone it was fun? Oh, that's right, I got paid $20. So because they had an adequate reason for their particular behavior, they didn't need to justify it or change their attitudes. Whereas the $1 group would think to themselves, why did I do all this work? It must have been because it was actually fun. On a side note, this is one of the reasons why you see hazing and why hazing can be effective. People will go, why am I going through all this humiliation? It must be because I really, really, really want to be a part of this group. It's so worth it.